Ever since I created my YouTube channel 3 years ago, I've been planning to make a video of my favorite series and standalones of all time. A quick summary of my tastes would be, I don't like adult fantasy. I don't like young adult. I prefer historical fiction with magical realism. I prefer shorter books that are executed well rather than long books that are diluted in the execution. What else do I have? I think that's all I want to say. Without further ado, let's get into the list. Okay, so first off, my favorite series, Harry Potter. Obviously, as you can tell from my channel name, Harry Potter is my one and only love. Well, my first and forever love is a better way to put it. The reason why Harry Potter is very special to me is because it's basically the series that made me a very critical reader, I think. If something wasn't as good as Harry Potter, I refuse to love it, if that makes any sense. And I'm not saying that Harry Potter is like the pinnacle of writing or anything like that, but for a middle grade series and like a YA series, it's like the peak. Next on this list would be the Bartimaeus trilogy. I feel like this is one of those exceptions on my list where I'm like, the prose isn't that great because there's a little bit of like emotional manipulation going on in terms of the prose. The author tries a little bit too hard to make the reader laugh. He tries a little bit too hard to make you like the main character. And the prose is very transparent, as in like you can clearly see what the author's trying to do. But the reason why I'm obsessed with this series is because it's the series that I reread the most after Harry Potter, I would say. Actually, I might have read the series way more than Harry Potter because, with Harry Potter, I love it so much, but the ending, like Deathly Hallows, I hate that book. I only really like the first 6 books in the series because the ending was horrible. Bartimaeus trilogy, though, oh my gosh, the ending was amazing. The next series on this list is probably my favorite series on this list, and that is The Once and Future King by T.H. White. This series, I was emotionally wrecked by the end of that book. I broke down bawling. The main character, King Arthur, is probably one of the most lovable characters that you'll ever see. He's so kind. He's so simple. He's so good-hearted. The first 2 books are rather hilarious in terms of like his childhood and all of that. But then as the series progresses, it becomes a lot more philosophical. It becomes a lot more somber. And yet there's still snatches of humor here and there. Yeah, I think this is the series that kind of changed my life as an adult. If Harry Potter and Bartimaeus defined my childhood, I would say that Once a Future King defines my adulthood. The next series on this list is the Six of Crows duology. There's so many trilogies and quartets and quintets that just go on unnecessarily. Six of Crows, though, I feel like the author packed a huge punch within just 2 books. The first book was really good, and it's the book that kind of got me hooked, but then the second book made me obsessed. Crooked Kingdom was a blast. I discovered it very randomly at Barnes & Noble one day in 2017, I think. I was headed for the fantasy section in the back right corner of Barnes & Noble, and I remember stopping dead in my tracks because I saw this beautiful cover of Six of Crows. This beautiful, sweeping, dark, glittering. I don't know, there's something about that cover that immediately grabbed my attention. Six of Crows has a very special place in my heart because it's like literally the only YA series that I came to love as an adult. And of course, because it's a duology, I really respected that the author wasn't just dragging shit out for the sake of dragging shit out. And I really hope she doesn't write a 3rd book, even though she's kind of hinted at that. Next one on this list is the Winternight trilogy. The Winternight trilogy is another series that I discovered as an adult. I loved it because it felt like Studio Ghibli movies embodied within a book. That's kind of what got me hooked into the first book. But then the second book really stepped it up in terms of like the characters and like the family dynamics, and even the romance kind of made me tear up a little bit, which was very unexpected because I actually don't really love romance in books. So yeah. Next series on this list is The Wicked Quartet. This is the source material for the Broadway musical. I love the very first book the most. The very first book has this very ominous feel to it where you can tell that the political winds are changing for the worse. The second book, by the way, if you haven't read it, it's basically following Elphaba's son. His romance with his lover left me very, very heartbroken. And then the third book had some revelations about a certain cat. If you've read the series, you know, but yeah, the third book just kind of blew my mind in terms of like the cat. I love how dark it is, basically. I love retellings that are dark. Now I'm going to talk about the standalones that I love. Again, this is just going to be a very eclectic standalone list, but let's try to get through them quickly because my voice is seriously getting hoarse. First off, Piranesi. I don't know if the review for Piranesi has come out quite yet, but Piranesi by Susanna Clarke is my new obsession. I read it back in 2021, and yet even 2 years later, I'm still obsessing with Piranesi. Like, I'm still thinking about that book. It's probably one of the most unique books I've read in recent years. Next one is Song of Achilles. I think that the beginning of Song of Achilles is really amazing, but then by the middle of the book, it starts to kind of meander a little bit. I thought that I was going to end up giving this book 4 stars, but then the fact that a certain death at the end brought together the main character and the person that he hated, it really beautifully wrapped up the themes of that book. The catharsis that you get at the end of Song of Achilles was amazing. Next book on this list is The Golem and the Genie. I read this book in 2014, and I read it because the Bartimaeus trilogy has golems and it has genies. And whenever I passed by The Golem and the Genie in Barnes & Noble, I kept on thinking of Bartimaeus, and that's why I randomly picked up The Golem and the Genie, and it ended up being a lot more entertaining than I actually thought it was going to be. And yeah, The Golem and the Genie is probably one of my favorite standalones of time. It's so good. Next one on this list is The Chosen by Chaim Potok. I think this is a very underrated book because it's got so many tropes that I love. It's got enemies to friends. It's got amazing family dynamics. The ending made me cry. Yeah, it's a great coming of age story. And if you haven't read it, I would highly recommend. Again, I read it when I was only in 9th grade, just out of curiosity by myself. And I was like immediately hooked from the beginning. It follows 2 Jewish boys during World War II, I think, in America. These 2 kids are basically not allowed to be friends for certain reasons. So it's almost got this like very Shakespearean Romeo and Juliet sort of thing going on, except it's not a romance. It's basically just a friendship. And yeah, it's definitely one of my favorite standalones of all time for me. Next one is The Giver by Lois Lowry. The ending is very moving. I love the twist about The Giver basically, and I love how earnest the characters are, and I love how earnest the writing is. Lois Lowry is definitely one of my favorite authors. Next one is The House of the Scorpion. This one I read when I was 12 years old. I hated it at the beginning because of how depressing it was, I would say. And yet I kept on wanting to read it again and again. Like when I read it, I was like, I hate it, but then I kept on thinking about it. And so I went to the library and checked it out again, and I kept on checking it out over and over again. So basically I became obsessed with this book, even though I hated it at the beginning. And then the ending emotionally devastated me in a good way. I think this is a very underrated YA novel. Next on this list is Ella Enchanted. I don't like fairy tale stuff. Well, I mean, now I do as an adult, but as a kid, I didn't like fairy tale stuff. I didn't really like princess stuff. But Ella Enchanted, I kept on coming back to it over and over again because I think it's one of the best retellings that I've read in my entire life. The main character is very clever. I really like her love interest. And yeah, Ella Enchanted is probably still one of my favorite standalones of all time. Let's see. The Thief Lord by Cornelia Funk. I love this author as a kid, particularly The Thief Lord, because the ending is rather bittersweet. Like, it's a happy ending, but it's also not really. Also, the reason why I liked it is because it's got tropes that I really liked. I really liked the trope of like kids living in the streets. Well, I mean, am I romanticizing that too much? Basically kids on the run, right? Running away from the adults. Like, those are stories that I kind of enjoyed as a kid. The other book of this author's that I really enjoyed. As a kid, I really enjoyed Inkheart, but I kind of grew out of it by the time that I was a teenager. But I recently read this a couple of years ago, and it was really good. It offers one of the best anti-heroes, morally gray heroes within the character of Dustfinger. He's very compelling as a character. Next one is To Kill a Mockingbird. I mean, what can I say? I think it's just a great book. One particular scene that I remember from that book is when Jem, the older kid, he is basically forced to go and read to this cranky old woman. One day, though, he discovers that she's dead, and his reaction really broke my heart. Next one is A Monster Calls by Patrick Ness. A Monster Calls made me snot cry. I don't really know what else to say about it. It just made me cry to the point snot was coming out of my nose. I don't think that I've cried that hard reading such a short book before. Next is The Little Prince. I read this recently, and my mom loves this book. And she kept on telling me, like, you should read it. And I didn't really trust her. I just thought, oh, it's going to be a cute little story. I'm not going to be that emotionally compelled by it as an adult. But then I read it, and I was, like, floored. It's a really great book. Next book is Maniac McGee. This was one of my favorite books as a kid, for sure. It's really funny. It's really wacky. And then the enemies to friends trope I really liked. And then he finds family at the end. Maniac McGee is such a great book, and I would recommend it if you have never read it before. Next book is The Road to Avalon by Joan Wolfe. This is another King Arthur retelling that I think is a really good gateway into King Arthur. I went in with no expectations when it came to this book, but it's a really good standalone. It's very short. It's really easy to get into it. The characters are it's a very character-driven story. I don't know, The Road to Avalon I think is a very underrated book. It's very, very good. The next one is The Last Unicorn. I read this as an adult. It's a great book. It's not like a favorite, but it did make me cry. I would love to reread it again because I only read it recently. Next is Wuthering Heights. The writing style is really weird when it comes to this book, but I love the characters. It's got a really interesting villain. He's an interesting character study. There's a lot of tragedies that happen, but also the ending is very happy, particularly for his ward, the villain's ward. I was very happy for his character arc. Last of the Wine by Mary Renault. This is a book that somebody recommended to me because they knew that I loved the Psalm of Achilles, and honestly, I can understand why. I think that Madeline Miller took a lot of inspiration from The Last of the Wine because there's a lot of similar plot beats to The Last of the Wine, I think. And if you love Psalm of Achilles, I would also recommend The Last of the Wine because it's very similar in that way. Next is The Watsons Go to Birmingham, is how you say it. This is a book that I adored as a kid. It's really, really funny. The family dynamics, it's really heartwarming. I love the family. It's very enjoyable, and I really like this author, by the way. Next is Bridge to Terabithia. I think this is a very well-known book. The ending, right? If you haven't read it, I'm not going to say anything, but the ending is very impactful. Next one is Shadow of the Wind. Honestly, I think that this book has some melodramatic elements to it. Towards the end, there's a little bit of melodrama that I wasn't like the biggest fan of, but the setup of this book and like the progression of this book I think is very nuanced, and I really, really enjoy Shadow of the Wind. Next is Stardust by Neil Gaiman. Neil Gaiman, I don't think that I'm the biggest fan of Neil Gaiman, and it's not because his prose is bad, honestly. I think that his wacky sense of humor, wacky type of storytelling style isn't really up my alley. But Stardust is like a fairy tale, basically. It's a very silly sort of fairy tale book, but then the ending made it very sad. I came to adore it because of that bittersweet ending. Next is The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton. I read this recently, I think 2 years ago, for the first time. There's a lot of angst. There's a lot of teenage angst going into that book, but the characters are very earnest. They're very heartfelt. The family dynamics are really amazing. I cried reading this book. Next is Tuck Everlasting. I think that people don't love this book, but I personally really like this book. I think that people might not love this book because the main character is only 10 years old, and then her love interest is like 17 years old, which is kind of creepy. But Tuck Everlasting, for me, the ending broke my heart so much. Are you seeing a pattern here of the books that I'm talking about here? I love books that give me emotional devastation. And the thing with like the toad and like the music box, just thinking about that ending, it was amazing. Next one is The Book Thief. The storytelling is very unique because it's basically told from the perspective of Death. Death is the one who narrates the events of World War II. So The Book Thief, again, was another book that I really enjoyed because it gave me emotional devastation at the very end. The romance, emotional devastation, you know what I'm talking about. Next one is Indian in the Cupboard. I don't know if this book holds up in today's culture. I don't know. It might be culturally insensitive. It might be racially insensitive. I have absolutely no idea. But as a kid, I loved miniature stuff. And this book follows a miniature Indian and this normal little kid. I don't know. There was elements and tropes to Indian in the Cupboard that I was obsessed with growing up. Next one on this list is, my voice is getting really hoarse, The Sign of the Beaver. Again, it's a book about Indians. Again, I'm not sure if this is culturally insensitive by today's standards, but I remember really loving this book. It's got all the tropes that I really enjoy, like living in within nature and really good friendships, by the way. Like friendships and family, I would take any day over romance. Okay, so the next ones on this list are my favorite manga and anime. I'm gonna go through this really, really quickly because my voice is getting very, very tired. Okay, so the first one on this list is Fullmetal Alchemist. This is a manga series that I discovered back in 2016, and I was positively floored. The reason why I was floored was because I think that the storytelling conventions are just like shattered when it comes to this series. The fact that the heroes find out who the villains are very early on, and the villains knew all along who the heroes are, but they can't attack each other for certain reasons. And therefore, the entire manga is basically this chess game of these oppositions existing within the same space and having to kind of politically maneuver around one another before they can attack each other at the very end. And just the storytelling beats was very unconventional, and it blew my mind at the beginning when I first read it. And it's also very, very short, by the way. The author packs a punch in a relatively shorter amount of time when it comes to manga. So yeah, I have a lot of respect for Fullmetal Alchemist because of those things. Next one would be the Cardcaptor Sakura series by Clamp. I think this was the very first manga that I read in my entire life as a kid. My mom bought me the Korean manga, and you know what? Actually, let me talk about Sailor Moon first. Sailor Moon was my obsession as a kid. I think that series kind of taught me the value of like learning to turn the other cheek, learning to love, learning to empathize for people. It was all about love, friendship, and family. And as cheesy as the messages were, Sailor Moon is the one that really instilled a lot of empathy within me as a child. It's got a very, very special place in my heart. That said, even though it was like the major defining thing for me as a kid, I think that as an adult, I do prefer Cardcaptor Sakura over Sailor Moon. Sailor Moon has a very special place in my heart, but as an adult, I prefer Cardcaptor Sakura. I like the fact that it's just a very sweet and simple story. I'm not saying that I'm recommending this to anybody because it's a very magical girl anime. It's for kids basically, but it's a very sweet, concise story. And I also love the authors, by the way. Speaking of which, the next series that I really, really enjoy is Alcoholic by the same author, by Clamp. Even though Cardcaptor Sakura is a very sweet and straightforward and concise story, Alcoholic is kind of the opposite. It starts to kind of talk about like multiverses, and it's really mind warping. It basically follows this high school kid who's able to see ghosts, and then one day he stumbles across this witch's shop, and she basically tells him she can help him not see ghosts anymore if he decides to become her assistant. And therefore he starts to go on errands for this witch, and he meets really weird people, he meets different entities, and then he starts to learn more about himself by the end. And then the ending is really, really devastating for me. It's a happy ending, but it's also dark to some extent because it's a little bit bittersweet. The lessons that you learn from it are just really strange, and yeah, I love it. So yeah, I think that's the end of the list. Let me know if you have any books in common with me. Let me know if you liked any of these books or if you hate any of these books. And oh my god, my voice is completely gone. Yeah, toodles.
물도 더 잘 주